Welcome to another edition of Anglican Unscripted. This is episode 189, and we're going to have some Supreme Court talk. Although I hear they may not be Supreme, and they may not be a court. We'll get into that later. I'm Kevin Carlson.
And I'm Alan Haley. And today is June 29, 2015.
Okay, I have a Supreme Court arguer and victor, Alan Haley. You, in case people didn't know, stood before the Supreme Court and argued a case, and you won.
That was many years ago.
Many years ago, in a different court, obviously. And we're going to talk about the Supreme Court, which made a decision last week in a vote that I was not surprised by, disappointed in, but knew that we're going to have to talk about it because the world out there is a-changing. And,
it certainly is.
And we have to talk about this from the legal perspective. We have to talk about this from the gospel perspective. The legal perspective is, in America, all 50 states must now allow their citizens to have same-sex marriage and heterosexual marriage. Further marriages will be determined in court cases. Whether there's 4, 5, 6, 7 people involved, we'll determine that later. And we need to talk about how this happened and the thinking of the justices. And I want to get Alan Haley's opinion because he is a great critiquer of the court. You put a piece up. You talked about whether or not this is supreme. And you and I were just talking before the show. And we have that been there, done that thing. People remember back, and full disclosure, I am a direct descendant of Brigham Young.
You are?
I need to let know my great-great-great-great-great-grandpa was Brigham Young.
Very
Sorry,
good.
I hate to bring that up, but you straight down the line, you get Kevin. So I am also a critiquer of Mormonism. I believe it's a cult. So I need to add that before we go any further. But the Mormons set the precedent for being victims of what Supreme Courts, Congresses, and the full weight of the U.S. government can do to you.
Correct. That's what happened in the 1880s and 1890s. Mm-hmm. There was an increasing campaign of penal legislation passed in Congress against the Mormon Church for its practice of polygamy. And ultimately this culminated in a law passed in 1887 that forfeited the church's property, all its property. It seized it, and Congress dissolved the church as a corporation. They appealed this to the courts, and it went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in an infamous decision in 1890, it held that Congress had the right to take away all the assets of the church because it was encouraging a public policy that was contrary to United States public policy, namely
which was polygamy.
Against polygamy at that time. And yes, the church was pushing something that the United States made illegal. Now, a little more than 100 years later, and given a few more years, actually, in the Supreme Court with this, as you say, the logic is pretty soon they're going to hold the right that there's a constitutional right to polygamy. Mm-hmm. So we're going to have gone completely 180 degrees around to where Congress now, under the same precedent, will have the right to pass statutes punishing churches for not endorsing polygamy. But what does that say about society in the space of 100 years doing that kind of a cartwheel? It's just incredible.
But Kevin, Alan, what about the protection of religious rights? It's there in the Constitution. It's part of the Bill of Rights. You can have free press, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. Well, none of those apply. There is no real freedom of speech. There is no real freedom of press, and there certainly is no freedom of religion.
Well, the problem is those rights, so to speak, are written in the Constitution, but there's nobody to defend them except certain lawyers in black robes.
Yes.
And that the latest decision by the 5 of those lawyers sitting in their ornate courtroom in Washington, has decreed that now there's a new constitutional right, namely the right to marry whomever you choose. Mm-hmm. And it's undefined, but it's a constitutional right, which means it can't be touched by any state statute or legislature anywhere. It can't be touched by any congressional statute. It can only be touched by the mechanism, the cumbersome mechanism of a constitutional amendment, or theoretically, 5 more justices could think the other way next year and overrule themselves. That's why I say it's really not a Supreme Court, because
have you been on peyote?
Whatever 5 people of them think from time to time.
I think you're on peyote if you think it's going to happen again.
Yeah, well,
but it is interesting how history repeats itself. Right. Now we are in this position where people are rumoring, well, can they force churches to perform same-sex marriages?
They can make it very expensive.
Yeah, they can't force anybody to do anything. Let's be upfront. However, right. They can make it punitive. They can make it expensive. They can dissolve. And as we learned from the Mormons, they can take all of your assets.
You can take all of your assets. The first thing they'll do, though, is they'll remove the tax exemptions.
Mm-hmm. And so, no tax exemptions. Well,
except for those churches that do allow same-sex marriage, such as our famous Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. It'll be fine with its tax exemption, so long as, I predict, it'll have to do one thing. It'll have to remove the opt-out clause that it's put into the marriage canon to allow any member of the clergy not to perform a marriage. They're going to not be able to opt out anymore. They're going to be required to perform same-sex marriages in order to conform to the Constitution as the justices declared it, and in order to keep their tax exemption. So by the next General Convention, I predict that opt-out clause will have to go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have now entered. We got a 2,000-year heads up. Jesus said these times were coming. Paul said it. Peter said it. All the New Testament authors warn of a time in the future when there will be persecution of Christians. A lot of people thought it was just the lions in the Colosseum. No, it's going to be throughout time. And for those of us who are whining about not having our tax exemptions or 501c, and I also need to let you know Anglican TV is a 501c, and we would probably lose it because we have a religious exemption under our 501c not-for-profit.
That's right. You're covering a group called Anglicans, and my goodness, if they don't espouse public policy the way the United States government now has declared it, your whole Anglican affiliation is in trouble.
Well, I don't see anywhere in the gospel narrative where Jesus said, go preach where you can get a tax benefit. I mean, I understand that it's helpful.
No, he said the opposite, didn't he? He said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's.
Yes, he did. And so all these benefits we've had as Christians have been our excuse to be kind of sloths in Christianity. We've dropped the ball. We had a wonderful society for many, many years that was Christian friendly. And it's not going to be that way anymore. And I'm not here to whine about it because I see in this world that we live in right now, in 2015, the most faithful Christians are in countries where they're persecuted. The greatest believers, the greatest prayers, the people who perform miracles aren't doing it here on the shores of America. They're in other regions around the world where they're found beheaded with orange suits. And they're not here on the shores of America right now.
No, and there's another point to realize too, Kevin. I think that's just as important, that Jesus foretold that this would happen. Mm-hmm. He said toward the end of the days, what's going to happen is Christians will become more and more persecuted. So if indeed we are approaching any kind of end times, we will see the level of persecution of Christians go up and up. And so I think the more we see that happen, the more we can be certain that maybe something is coming to a close here, because I think if the persecution gets into the level that you're talking about, hopefully not beheadings or anything like that, but in the United States with confiscations and seizures, and there's no sign that the other faction, the liberalist people that were pushing this, are going to exercise any restraint or mercy whatsoever. They're going to go after this religion that has they see as a group of bigots that has hated them for so long, and they're going to exact a revenge that's going to be quite something to see, in my view. And wouldn't be surprised, as I say, to see in the next 5 years it's going to heat up dramatically.
Yeah. Well, I'm a betting guy. I guarantee in 10 years, most religious exemptions will no longer be IRS recognized. You know, and it's a reality. So what are we going to do about it? Are we going to sit and whine about what we're losing, or are we going to continue to do what we're called to do, and that's to make disciples? Right. You know, our call is not to defend political mechanisms of capitalism and communism and socialism. Our job is much different. Jesus was brought up in a Roman-occupied Israel, and I read the Gospels frequently. I don't see him complaining about the Romans.
No.
You know, same on
too much important other things to do.
So, you know, if you're worried about the politics of the day, you really need to repent and turn more towards exactly the life that Jesus was living, because that's what you're called to do as well.
Right.
If you're in a situation that is not comfortable, well, you're actually being blessed by the Lord, because He's calling you to a way to be more faithful to Him. You know, I hate to be the preacher here, but now we also need Christian leaders who are going to stand up and start to teach us how to live in persecution.
Yes.
You know, and lead us into this time, because we've had a wonderful 400 years in America, and it's time now that we be prepared by our Christian leaders for a different time, and how to react without sounding like whiners, but to act as Christ would act in these situations. Right,
and as you pointed out, Christians are known for bearing up under all kinds of persecution. That's the test of their faith. Then if they're true Christians, they don't fail that test. They bear it out under whatever degree, and we've seen witness to that for centuries. So it's now our turn.
Yeah, it's our turn, and it's something you pray about. Yes. Jesus was on his knees about this, and we will as well. As far as future court fights, we were never intended as Christians to fight things in court. But now there's a new presiding bishop in the Episcopal Church who, when interviewed by David Virtue and George Conger at a press conference, said he would end litigation.
I didn't hear that. I heard that he would try to be more accommodating within the Anglican framework. But I didn't hear him actually promise to end the litigation. But of course, I was out of town.
I didn't say promise. You added a word I didn't, which is you're pretty good at making sure words show. He had indicated he would stop, and so that. You know, and there's also an indication that David Booth Beers will be stepping down, because they're giving him an award for all his years of service, and you really don't do that unless somebody's saying goodbye. And so, if all that happens, do they just stop in South Carolina? Do they stop in Texas?
It's very difficult to do that. They have to notify the court if they want their appeal, for example, in South Carolina dismissed. Then the judgment of the lower court will stand, and so they would have to tell the court, we're no longer going to litigate this. We will concede that the lower court decision remains.
Does that open them up to having to pay all the bills?
Well, yeah, that's what the trial court judge held, that they would have to, for their antics down there in challenging trademarks and everything like that, they would be liable for those costs. In San Joaquin, it's a little different, because we're the ones appealing. They won below, so I don't know how they can drop what they say that was a victory. So they would have to stipulate that the judgment could be reversed, and I just don't see that happening. I mean, David Booth Beers is on that team, and I don't know that he's indicated he's going to resign from that aspect of it. So we'll have to just wait and see how this develops. But don't forget, nothing's going to take place until November 1st. That's when Bishop Curry gets into the powers of the office, and we'll have to start seeing what he does after that. But the Supreme Court decision in South Carolina, rather, is probably going to come down before then, because those oral arguments are September 23rd. And there won't be a decision, I don't think, in San Joaquin that soon. But as I say, that's a completely different situation there. And Fort Worth, again, it's like the same thing in South Carolina, the decision below, they'd have to give up their right to appeal.
Okay. All right. Now, I don't know if you've been paying attention to Anglican Ink. You're a busy guy. There has been some activity at St. James the Great.
Yes.
Which used to be St. James Newport Beach.
Right.
Which, now we need to be open here, you were part of the litigation team, right?
Not in the St. James case, no.
Not the St. James case.
No, I've written a lot about it and followed it, and of
good.
course, and I know the Crockers, who
Good.
Father Crocker there.
Mm-hmm. So, if I ask you something about this, we're not going to jeopardize anything.
No.
Okay. Because it was decided that St. James belonged to the diocese. They won the case. The diocese had convinced the court that it was hierarchical all the way up to General Convention. And if my interpretation of the results are, only General Convention can sell properties in California.
It has to consent to release of the Dennis Cannon interest, correct?
All right.
The Dennis Cannon interest.
So they put in a new parish there, run by a female clergy,
A vicar, right?
A vicar, and she was growing the congregation. According to her, wonderful things were happening. All of a sudden, a Bishop Bruno, you probably never heard of him, decides to sell the church under her without informing her or the congregation. Oh, by the way, I sold your parish.
Yeah, he first preceded that with a maneuver that was a little bit questionable.
Mm-hmm.
He had the diocesan council, I guess, vote to put the church into the name of the corporation sole, where he controls it completely.
A smart move, by the way.
Well, he didn't. Then he didn't have to get the permission of the standing committee to make the sale or do whatever we wanted to do. It's now in the corporation sole, and so that makes challenging the thing difficult. But it also calls into question, I mean, his motive, because obviously he had this in mind a long time before the actual, sale now has come out and be public. He's obviously been dealing in this possibility for some time, because that diocese had to spend over $3 to $4 million on all this litigation, and so they're probably hurting, and he needs to get some money back in the coffers.
Can she say to the courts, listen, the latest decision from the courts on these types of cases was only General Convention can sell this?
That would be interesting if she took that tack. I didn't see that in the complaint that she filed.
It was not.
So
I'm like, you didn't call her? I was expecting her to have some of the best Anglican defense team in the world. I thought for sure you would be working for her, but can she use that as a defense?
Well, it's actually the buyer who ought to worry about it most, because is he getting clear title or not under the trial court's decision, which of course never got up to an appellate court level, and so it's never been made a statewide policy, but it's certainly questionable enough down there in Orange County. The Orange County Superior Court ruled, as I said, that the Dennis Cannon interest could, a bishop was unable on his own to release it. It had to be with the consent of General Convention, and that's just construing the California statute, 9142C, applicable to religious corporations. The trust that's imposed by the national church can only be released by the national church. And so therefore, it would be the buyer's attorney who should be alerted to this problem, and that would be a real interesting thing, because if I were advising the buyer, I would probably say, if they can't get a release, and General Convention is going to be over in a few more days, they better hurry. Then you're going to wait 3 years, and I wouldn't advise you to go forward with this transaction.
All right. So let's do a summary here, which you lawyers have to do quite often. You have to summarize the summary of the summary of the summary. It's what you get paid to do.
We're in very uncertain times, Kevin.
We are.
We're in that wherever 5 people in black robes can tell the rest of the country what they have to do, that we've never quite lost that degree of freedom as we lost it last Friday.
Indeed.
We've never been in that position quite so before.
All right, I want to thank you for your time. People are looking right now, where did Kevin go? Well, my battery just ran out of the camera, but thankfully my mic is still on. I'm going to put up some picture. I'm going to put up a rainbow picture of me like we do on Facebook. Oh, Alan, thank you so much for your time, and we'll catch you soon, I know. God bless.
Bye.